Welcome to this sixth presentation on the explanation of the Eucharist. In this presentation, I'd like to dwell a little bit more on the liturgy of the Word, taking a look at a more historical and focused look upon what is called the general instruction of the Roman Missal. The general instruction of the Roman Missal is a document found at the beginning of the Missal that explains the theology of the Mass and how to celebrate it. It's designed primarily for priests, deacons, and contains details on their participation in the Eucharist. It's also of interest to various ministers and students of the liturgy. But first, a little history of the development of the liturgy of the Word. This will be a little more detailed than it was in the previous presentation. Following Jewish tradition, the first Christians read from the Law and the Prophets. To this, the apostles added their own memoirs and recollections of Jesus. As the apostles wrote letters to the various communities, these were read to the whole community and, of course, were jealously guarded and preserved. In time, the various communities shared these precious letters. But as the apostles died and the evangelists began to write their Gospels, these were proclaimed in the churches, since there were fewer and fewer of the original disciples of Jesus left alive to tell the story. From the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the Church had the practice of continuously reading from a book of Scripture at the liturgy. This meant that you started a book or letter or Gospel at the beginning, and each Sunday picked up where you stopped the previous Sunday. Of course, on special occasions, they read from the appropriate passages that reflected the feast being celebrated. For example, the reading of the passage of the Annunciation was read on March 25th, or the birth of Christ on December 25th. Later, location also played a role in deciding what passage might be read on special feasts. For example, in Rome, St. Luke's account of the birth of Jesus was chosen for the Midnight Mass because it was celebrated in the Basilica of St. Mary Major, which contained a relic of the crib of Christ. The Gospel for Christmas Day was taken from the beginning of the Gospel of St. John. In the beginning was the Word, because it was celebrated in the Cathedral Church of St. John Lateran in Rome. Until the Middle Ages, that is around the 9th century, 3 readings were always proclaimed on a Sunday. The first from the Old Testament, the second from one of the letters of the Apostles, or the book of Revelation, and the third from the Gospels. During the Middle Ages, these readings were reduced to 2, omitting the Old Testament reading the majority of time. This happened because Latin ceased to be understood by the majority of people, and that being the case, lay people ceased to proclaim the readings at Mass. In this case, the readings of the Mass were added to the priest's Missal, to his book of prayers, and all the readings, all the prayers were proclaimed at the altar, away from the people by the priest alone. Since the priest read all the prayers and readings of the Mass, he tended to shorten by omitting several parts, especially those parts where the people would not understand or didn't participate in, such as the Old Testament reading and also the prayer of the faithful. The responses of the Mass were no longer made by the people, but only by the servers. That's why the bishops of Vatican II called for a return to a fuller use of Scripture and the restoration of the lectionary as a separate book of Scripture readings for Mass. In addition, they restored the ministry of reader or lector to lay people. Today, our lectionary contains a 3-year cycle of readings for Sundays that uses the 3 synoptic Gospels. St. Matthew is read in year A, St. Mark in year B, and St. Luke in year C. Don't worry, the Gospel of St. John has not been omitted. It is read during the Christmas and Easter seasons in all 3 of the cycles. The Old Testament first readings are selected mainly for their connection with the Sunday Gospel story. Excerpts from the letters of the Apostles and the Acts of the Apostles are used for the second readings. In Easter season, we do not read from the Old Testament, but from the Acts of the Apostles. Now, these are mainly read continuously, independent of the other 2 readings. On weekdays, we have a 2-year cycle of readings. Another change since Vatican II is the use of the ambo or lectern for the Proclamation of Paul, the Scripture readings. Previously, they were read at the altar by the priest. The first reading in the psalm on the right side, called the epistle side, and the gospel on the left side, which naturally was called the gospel side. The general instruction states that the readings, responsorial psalm and the Easter proclamation, the exultet, are proclaimed only from the ambo. It may be used also for the homily and the general intercessions, but the dignity of the ambo requires that only a minister of the word should go up to it. This means that all the readings, including the responsorial psalm, are to be proclaimed from the one and same ambo. Announcements and other things that are announced at the Eucharist, which are not scriptural, should be announced from a different location. Further, the GIRM, or the general instruction, underlines the fact that the first and second reading should be proclaimed by a layperson, not a priest or a deacon. By tradition, the function of proclaiming the readings is what we call ministerial, not presidential. That is, it belongs to the ministers of the church, not to the priest who presides. Therefore, it says a lector should proclaim the readings. At the beginning of the Liturgy of the Word, the focus of the celebration shifts from the priest chair to the ambo. In the general instruction, the ambo is the place where the word is proclaimed. Thus, in addition to the scripture readings, it is the proper place for the cantor to lead the responsorial psalm, and the priest or deacon to read the gospel and to give the homily. The announcer of the petitions or intentions to the prayer of the faithful are also announced at the ambo. This means that those who lead the songs, make announcements, should do so from a different location. Now, the general instruction places greater emphasis on the necessity and the importance of silence during the Eucharist, but especially in the Liturgy of the Word. This was not necessary when Mass was in Latin before Vatican II, since the people were mostly silent throughout the Mass. Thus, they had many opportunities for reflection and time to say their own prayers. But now that the Mass is mostly communal prayer, we must ensure that there are enough times of silence for the people to reflect and pray for their intentions. While the Mass, of course, is corporate, it also has to be personal. And so the general instruction calls for a balance of this corporate and individual prayer for vocal and silent prayer. Thus, it calls for a significant period of silence after each reading and the homily. This is necessary in our busy world in order that we may reflect on what we have just heard and let God's word sink into our hearts. The call for silence also underscores the importance of the scriptures, not only in our worship, but also in our daily lives. Hearing the word every week as part of our spiritual lives can lead us to continued conversion in the way that we live as Jesus' disciples from day to day. Another emphasis of the general instruction are the various forms of singing. It has already been noted that the responsorial psalm, or at least the refrain, should be sung. The gospel acclamation is also sung. In fact, it is omitted if it is not. The preference, of course, is that it is sung. By its very nature, the Liturgy of the Word contains many words. Thus, it's important to balance this with other elements, such as music and ritual, which are important elements to promote the active participation of the people. Since the Gospel is the center of the Liturgy of the Word, it contains the principal ritual element. In a part of the Mass, as I said, that is mainly words, it is important that the ritual element be carried out well. A procession of the Book of Gospels from the altar to the ambo is accompanied by servers carrying candles and even servers carrying incense. This should be a true procession accompanied by the gospel acclamation. And so it's generally recommended that the procession wind its way around the altar in front of the congregation to the ambo. The servers with the candles then stand on each side of the ambo facing the Book of Gospels. I recently met someone who had been traveling around to many churches in the Archdiocese of Kingston. He remarked how in many churches the Gospel book was used and that the procession went around the altar to the ambo. He had never seen this in many other places. They simply went directly from the altar to the ambo. I think this is a tribute to the many priests and people who try to celebrate the liturgy well. Just before the pandemic struck, we had a number of workshops for musicians and priests on celebrating Holy Week and the Easter Triduum. Unfortunately, none of us had the opportunity to implement any of this, but I was impressed with the dedication and the ingenuity of our parish musicians in implementing the general instructions. For many years, the lectionary has been carried in the entrance procession by a reader. Excuse me. Now the revised general instruction has directed that the Book of Gospels be the only book that is carried in procession. In fact, this is not really new. The general instruction has always referred to the Book of Gospels. It's just that in our country we never had one. And so our parish practice substituted the lectionary for the Book of Gospels. Now that we have a Book of the Gospels, it's a reminder that the lectionary is simply placed on the ambo before the celebration begins. When the Book of Gospels is used, it is carried by the deacon. If this is in the entrance procession, if there's no deacon, it's carried by one of the readers. Another option is to place it on the altar before the celebration begins. But the Gospel book is always placed flat down upon the altar and closed. In this way, it does not distract from the ambo, which is the place for the proclamation of all the scripture readings, nor does it take the focus away from the presidential chair during the introductory rites, or from the ambo during the liturgy of the Word.